The unseen threat. It was a crisp, warm afternoon in the bustling city of Atlanta when FBI Special Agent Tara Johnson found herself driving through the busy streets, her mind consumed by the recent developments of a high-stakes investigation. The drug cartel she had been tracking for months had been elusive, but she was finally piecing together the puzzle. Tara's eyes remained on the road, but her thoughts kept looping back to the intel she had just received from her informants. Tara was no stranger to working under pressure. A seasoned agent in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, she had proven herself time and again in the face of adversity. And yet, despite her success, she had often felt like an outsider in a field dominated by white men. As one of the very few black women in the FBI, she faced challenges that many of her colleagues could not fathom. But she had learned to rise above it, focusing instead on the importance of her work and the difference she was making. As she drove, she reflected on her journey, how she had climbed through the ranks, how she had overcome prejudice and doubt from those who underestimated her abilities. Today, she was closer than ever to cracking the case, and the pride she felt in her work kept her going. But just as her thoughts began to settle, the flashing blue lights of a police cruiser appeared in her rearview mirror. Tara glanced down at the speedometer, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't speeding. Confusion crept over her as she pulled over to the side of the road, trying to figure out what had prompted the stop. Her hand instinctively moved toward her badge, resting in her jacket pocket, ready to explain her position if necessary. A police car slowly pulled up behind her, and a tall white officer stepped out. His stiff gait and stern expression immediately raised Tara's suspicions. She had encountered difficult cops before, but this one radiated an air of hostility that she could not quite place. His uniform looked standard, but his presence felt different, aggressive, even. Tara rolled down the window and gave him a polite nod, trying to remain calm. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer's name badge read Daniels, but he barely glanced at her, instead barking a command. "License and registration." Tara, slightly taken aback by his curt tone, remained composed. "Of course, officer. But just to let you know, I'm an FBI agent. I'm on duty." She reached for her badge, holding it out for him to see. Daniels gave it only a fleeting glance before his frown deepened. "I said, license and registration," he repeated, more forcefully this time, almost as though he hadn't seen the badge at all. Tara's heart sank. There was something off about this situation. She knew she had every right to be on the road and had done nothing wrong, but Daniels was acting as though she were a criminal. Still, she maintained her composure. "I'm an FBI agent," she reiterated, her voice calm but firm. "I'm on official duty, and I'm headed back to my office." Daniels didn't even acknowledge her words. Instead, he took another step closer, his hand hovering ominously near the holster of his gun. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice cold. Tara froze for a moment. This wasn't normal. In all her years in law enforcement, she had never been treated like this. But she knew that escalating the situation wouldn't help either. "Officer, there is no reason for me to exit the vehicle. I'm complying with your request for license and registration. Please, just let me get back to my duties." But Daniels wasn't listening. "Step out of the vehicle," he repeated, this time with a sharper edge to his voice, drawing the attention of nearby pedestrians. Tara could feel the heat of their gaze, but she kept her focus on the officer. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, struggling to keep the frustration from creeping into her voice. She had dealt with difficult situations in her career, but this was escalating quickly, and she didn't know why. Without warning, Daniels's tone shifted, his patience apparently exhausted. "Are you deaf? I said step out." His voice was louder now, causing people on the sidewalk to stop and stare. Some were even pulling out their phones, recording the interaction. Tara was now certain something wasn't right, but she didn't want to escalate things further. She slowly opened the door, ensuring her movements were deliberate and non-threatening. The last thing she needed was to give Daniels an excuse to take things to the next level. As soon as her feet hit the ground, Daniels moved swiftly, grabbing her by the arm with a force that startled her. She hadn't expected this level of aggression from an officer who should have been following protocol. "Hey, what are you doing?" Tara protested, her voice tight with disbelief. "Resisting arrest, huh?" Daniels sneered as he twisted her arm behind her back, applying pressure. "You think you can just flash a badge and get away with anything?" The words struck like a slap in the face. Tara winced, but she didn't let herself show weakness. She knew she had to remain calm if she was going to get through this. But the reality of what was happening hit her hard. Here she was, a federal agent, being treated like a criminal by someone who refused to acknowledge her authority. The handcuffs were tight, digging into her wrists as Daniel shoved her toward his patrol car. "This is ridiculous," Tara muttered under her breath, struggling to keep her emotions in check. She had worked with criminals, drug lords, and terrorists, but nothing had prepared her for this kind of treatment. She was being humiliated in front of a crowd, and no one was doing anything to help. Her heart was racing now, but she kept her head high. As Daniels pushed her into the back seat of the patrol car, Tara glanced at the faces around her. Some were watching in disbelief, others whispering among themselves, but no one was stepping forward to intervene. Tara's frustration grew, but so did her resolve. She couldn't let this go without consequence. Once the door slammed shut, Tara took a slow, steadying breath. She had been through a lot in her career, but this felt different. This felt personal. Officer Daniels' actions had crossed a line that could not be ignored. He wasn't just disrespecting her. He was undermining her identity as an FBI agent, and that was something she couldn't allow. As the car began to pull away, she made a silent vow to herself. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. She would make sure that Officer Daniels paid the price for his actions, no matter how long it took. She was a woman on a mission now, and nothing, not even this officer's twisted sense of power, was going to stop her from seeking justice. Tara sat back, eyes narrowed, as the patrol cars sped through the streets. The city passed by in a blur, but her mind was sharp. This would be her fight, and it was a fight she would win. Unmasking the truth. The hum of the engine filled the patrol car as Officer Daniels drove, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Tara sat silently in the back, her hands still handcuffed tightly behind her back. The cold metal bit into her skin, but it was the rising anger inside her that made her feel the most uncomfortable. She had been through intense operations, from hostage rescues to covert missions in foreign countries, but nothing had prepared her for the humiliating experience of being wrongfully detained by a racist cop, especially one who had so blatantly disregarded her authority. Tara's mind was racing. The first thing she needed to do was regain control of the situation. She had to stay calm, but it was difficult. She had worked years to prove herself in an institution that was often hostile to women of color, and now here she was, being treated like a criminal for no reason other than her skin color and the prejudice of the officer driving her to an unfamiliar police station. She had a duty to uphold, and this wasn't just about her. This was about the bigger picture. The streets of Atlanta blurred past as the car moved through more residential areas. Tara tried to pay attention to the landmarks, noting the direction they were heading, in case she needed to act quickly. They were clearly leaving the central precinct, heading into a quieter, more remote part of the city. Her stomach churned as she realized they were moving away from the well-lit, familiar areas of law enforcement, towards a station she had never heard of before. This wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. Officer Daniels had deliberately taken her somewhere remote, likely to avoid any scrutiny. Tara knew enough about police departments and their internal politics to recognize when something was being hidden. Officer Daniels wasn't just out of line. He was covering up for something, and she needed to figure out what it was. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice calm but demanding. She needed information, anything that could give her leverage. Daniels didn't respond immediately, his face impassive as he drove, but she could feel the tension in the air. Tara wasn't just an ordinary woman in a difficult situation. She was a trained FBI agent, a person with a responsibility to uphold the law. And she wasn't going to let this go quietly. Daniels finally looked at her through the rearview mirror, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Not that it matters, but we're heading to a small precinct on the outskirts of the city. You won't be there long. Just enough time for me to show you who's in charge around here. Tara felt a chill run down her spine. There was a sinister undertone to his words that unsettled her. She had seen this kind of power play before, the kind where someone in authority, feeling threatened or jealous, tried to remind others of their place through intimidation and force. But this was different. This wasn't just about asserting dominance. This was about something deeper. Daniels was making a statement, one that didn't just involve her, but her entire career. The patrol car slowed as it turned onto a quiet street lined with trees. Tara's gaze sharpened as she looked at the building ahead. It was an older structure, far less modern than the sleek, high-tech precincts she was accustomed to working with. The building looked abandoned, its windows dark and uninviting. The sign outside indicated it was a police station, but there was something off about the place. The energy of the location was wrong. Too quiet, too isolated. The car pulled into a small, nearly empty parking lot, and Tara's pulse quickened. This wasn't just an ordinary police stop. They weren't at a regular precinct where standard protocol could be followed. Tara realized that Daniels had intentionally chosen this location because it was out of the public eye. Whatever game he was playing, it was being done in the shadows. Daniels turned off the engine and got out of the car, not bothering to offer Tara any assistance. He opened the back door with a forceful motion, grabbing her arm roughly and yanking her out. The cuffs dug deeper into her skin as she was pushed forward, but Tara resisted the urge to flinch. She couldn't let him see how much this was affecting her. She had to remain in control. "Let's get you inside," he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. The door to the station creaked open, and Tara was led inside. It was eerily quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound breaking the silence. There were only a few officers scattered around the station, all of whom looked up briefly before returning to whatever mundane tasks they were occupied with. None of them looked surprised to see Daniels dragging her in. In fact, there was a certain air of indifference that made Tara's stomach turn. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a place where this kind of behavior was normalized. Daniels pushed her roughly past the front desk, where an older officer barely lifted his head to acknowledge them. Tara noticed the lack of attention from the other officers, the almost calculated disinterest they had in her presence. It was as though they had seen this play out before and had accepted it as part of the routine. But Tara wasn't going to accept it. Not this time. They reached the back of the station, where a small interrogation room awaited. Tara's heart thudded in her chest as she was shoved inside. The room was stark, nothing but a metal table, 2 chairs, and a dim light overhead. As the door slammed shut behind her, Tara's mind raced with possible strategies. She knew she had to keep it together. She had to outsmart Daniels, but it wasn't just him she was up against. She was up against the system that allowed this kind of behavior to persist. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Tara's mind flickered to the people outside, those who had recorded the incident, who had witnessed the injustice, but had done nothing. She couldn't let this become another forgotten moment. She needed to expose Daniels for who he really was. He wasn't just a rogue cop, he was part of a larger problem, a system that allowed abuse of power to fester and grow. Tara knew she couldn't bring him down on her own, but she also knew that she couldn't back down. Her thoughts were interrupted as the door opened again, and a younger officer entered. Tara turned to look at him, instantly noting his hesitation. Unlike Daniels, this officer seemed uncertain, almost nervous. His eyes avoided her gaze as he pulled out a file from under his arm. He glanced at the file briefly, then looked at Tara, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Agent Johnson," he asked, his voice tentative. "I'm Officer Mitchell. I've been assigned to process you. But I just want to say I'm sorry about all of this. Tara studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. He was younger, probably in his early 30s, and his nervousness was palpable. He didn't carry the same air of arrogance that Daniels did, and for a moment, Tara allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, this officer could be her ally. Mitchell fidgeted with the papers in his hands, clearly struggling with the situation. I know this isn't right. You don't deserve to be treated like this, he mumbled, glancing toward the door as if afraid Daniels would burst in at any moment. Tara nodded slowly. I'm glad you understand, but what are you going to do about it? Mitchell shifted his weight, his discomfort growing. I don't know. Daniels is the senior officer here. He's in charge, and, well, you know how things go. I can't just go against him. Tara leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense. You don't have to go against him, but you do have to stand up for what's right. You know this is wrong, Mitchell. You can be a part of something better than this. The silence that followed was heavy, but Mitchell's expression softened just a little. He knew, deep down, that he had a choice. Tara had made her case, and now it was up to him to decide what kind of person he wanted to be. Would he let Daniels's actions go unchecked, or would he choose to be an ally in her fight for justice? But before Mitchell could respond, the door swung open again, and Officer Daniels entered, his cold eyes narrowing as he glanced at the two of them. What's going on in here? He barked. Tara straightened, meeting his gaze without flinching. She knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. She would find a way to make sure Daniels's wrongdoings came to light, no matter the cost. The breaking point. The harsh fluorescent lights in the interrogation room flickered overhead, casting long, uneven shadows on the walls. Tara sat rigid in the metal chair, her wrists still bound by the cold, unforgiving handcuffs. The cuffs were starting to feel like a constant reminder of her situation, one that she never thought she would find herself in. Every moment spent in this claustrophobic space, every second of silence, only served to deepen the anger and resolve building inside her. As the door slammed open and Officer Daniels stormed into the room, Tara felt a surge of determination. He was the embodiment of everything she had fought against in her career, the type of man who believed that his badge was a symbol of power to be wielded recklessly, without consequence. His arrogance was palpable, the air around him thick with a sense of entitlement. But Tara had no intention of letting him get away with it. Not this time. What the hell are you two whispering about? Daniels barked, his eyes cold and calculating as they shifted between Tara and Officer Mitchell, who was still standing in the doorway, looking more uncomfortable by the second. Mitchell, his face drawn tight with unease, immediately straightened. Sir, I was just processing the agent's information. It's a standard procedure. Processing her? Daniel sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. She's not some suspect to be processed, Mitchell. She's a criminal. That's what she is. Now get her out of here. Tara's jaw tightened as Daniels's words hit her like a physical blow. His intent was clear. He wasn't just trying to humiliate her. He was trying to erase her identity, strip her of her authority. He wanted her to feel small, powerless, but she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Officer Daniels, I've told you this once, and I'll tell you again, Tara said, her voice unwavering. I am a federal agent, and you have no right to hold me. This is an abuse of power, and I'm not going to let it stand. Daniels didn't respond immediately. Instead, he crossed the room, his boots clanging against the concrete floor with each step. The tension between them hung in the air like an electric current, thick and charged. He stopped in front of her, towering over her with his chest puffed out. Tara didn't flinch. If he was hoping to intimidate her, he would be disappointed. Think you're untouchable, huh? Daniels spat, his face inches from hers. You think because you've got a fancy badge and a high and mighty attitude, you can just walk all over people like me. Let me tell you something, Agent Johnson. You're nothing. Just another person to put in their place. Tara's pulse quickened, but she maintained her composure. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to break her down with words. She had learned long ago how to stay calm, to keep her mind clear. But there was something about Daniels that made her blood boil. His words weren't just about her. They were about everything she had worked for, everything she had fought against. And she wasn't going to let him tarnish that. "You're right about one thing," Tara said, her tone firm but controlled. "I am an FBI agent, and I've worked my ass off to get here. I've earned every inch of the respect I get, whether you like it or not. But you're nothing but a bully hiding behind a badge. And I'm not going to let that slide." Daniels took a step back, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. For a brief moment, Tara saw something flicker in his eyes, something like doubt, or maybe it was anger. It was hard to tell. But whatever it was, it didn't last long. His face quickly returned to its usual scowl, and he shot a glance at Mitchell, who was still standing by the door, his hands nervously shifting from one pocket to the other. "Get her out of here," Daniels snapped. "Take her to holding." Mitchell, clearly conflicted, hesitated before he spoke. "Sir, I don't think this is right. She's an agent. We can't just—" "Don't question me, Mitchell," Daniels roared, his voice booming in the small room. "Do your damn job and get her out of here. Now." Tara could see Mitchell flinch at the sharpness of Daniels's words, his eyes darting to the door as if he was afraid someone might hear. He didn't want to be a part of this, but he was caught between following orders and doing the right thing. Tara could see it in his eyes, the internal struggle that was slowly eating away at him. She knew that, despite his discomfort, he wasn't going to act unless given a stronger push. She needed to take a risk. "Mitchell," Tara said softly, her voice almost a whisper, but with an authority that demanded attention. "You know this isn't right. You can't just sit by and let Daniels ruin everything. Help me. I can help you. This doesn't have to be your mess too." Mitchell's eyes widened slightly, his hands faltering in mid-motion as he looked at her, clearly torn. But before he could respond, the door to the room flew open once again, and a new figure stepped inside. An older officer, his face stern, his uniform impeccable. He scanned the room briefly before his gaze fell on Tara, then Mitchell, and finally landed on Daniels. "Daniels, what the hell is going on here?" the officer asked, his voice low but filled with authority. His eyes flickered to the handcuffs still on Tara's wrists, and his brow furrowed in confusion. Daniels's face darkened. "She's a criminal, Chief. Tried to flash some badge and get out of a traffic stop. We're holding her for processing." The older officer, whom Tara now realized must be the station's chief, shook his head. "That's not how this works, Daniels. You don't just arrest people because you don't like them. Especially not federal agents. Let her go." Tara couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope as the officer's words sank in. For the first time since she had been pulled over, it seemed like there was someone who might actually do the right thing. But Daniels wasn't ready to let go just yet. "This isn't your call, Chief," Daniels growled, clearly unwilling to admit that he had overstepped his bounds. "I'm handling it." The chief's eyes hardened. "You're not handling anything. You've already made a mess of this. I'm taking over from here." Tara couldn't believe it. Was she finally going to be released? Or was this just another step in Daniels's manipulation of the situation? She could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air. And as the chief moved toward her, he gently unlocked the cuffs that had been cutting into her skin. The release of pressure was immediate, but it didn't ease the tension that still clung to the room. As the cuffs fell away, Tara's eyes locked on Daniels, whose anger was boiling just below the surface. For a fleeting second, she could see the fury in his eyes, the rage that only someone who had just been publicly overruled could feel. But Tara knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. "Daniels," the chief said, his voice cold. "You're done. I'll handle this from here. You're not going to get away with this. Not this time." Daniels's face reddened, his jaw tightening as he stood there in stunned silence. It was clear that his hold on the situation was slipping, and for the first time, Tara could see the fear in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, and he certainly wasn't accustomed to being exposed as a bully who used his badge to harass and intimidate. Tara's gaze never wavered as she met the chief's eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady and filled with determination. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." The chief nodded slowly. "I know, and we'll make sure this gets sorted out." As the officers began to file out of the room, Tara stood tall. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time since she had been dragged into this nightmare, she felt like she had a fighting chance. She would make sure Daniels was held accountable for his actions, and if she had to take on the system itself, she would, no matter the cost. The tipping point. Tara's pulse still raced as the handcuffs were removed, and the sting of being wrongfully detained lingered. The abruptness of the situation had caught her off guard at first, but now, a sense of determination was slowly replacing the anger and frustration. She had been subjected to a personal attack, yes, but she was not one to back down easily. This was not just about her. It was about holding someone accountable for abusing their position of power. Officer Daniels had crossed a line, and now it was time for him to pay the consequences. As the chief officer motioned for her to follow him out of the interrogation room, Tara straightened her posture. There was a certain level of dignity in how she carried herself now. Calm, collected, and laser-focused. The room, with its dim lighting and harsh, sterile ambience, had felt stifling, but stepping out into the main area of the station was a different kind of challenge. The officers who had once ignored her presence were now watching with curiosity. Some of them glanced nervously at Tara, their eyes darting between her and Daniels, as if unsure how to react. Others, more jaded or perhaps complicit in Daniels's behavior, simply pretended not to notice. Tara didn't care. The moment she stepped through the door, her thoughts shifted entirely to the next step in her plan, ensuring that Daniels's actions didn't just get swept under the rug. She needed to make sure this wasn't another case that was quietly ignored because of the officer's badge and his ability to manipulate the system. "Where are we going?" Tara asked, her voice steady as she addressed the chief, who had been leading her toward the back hallway. "The captain's office," the chief replied, his voice low and matter-of-fact. He glanced back at her, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not going to let him get away with this. We're going to sort this out the right way, Agent Johnson." Tara nodded, relieved but not entirely convinced. The chief's words were comforting, but she knew all too well how things like this could be swept under the rug. She had seen too many cases of abuse of power in her career to trust that simply making a report would lead to real change. She would have to be persistent. The hallway was quiet, save for the muffled voices coming from the various offices that lined it. As they passed the closed doors, Tara's mind turned over the events that had led her here. She had been dragged out of her car without cause, verbally humiliated, and arrested by a police officer who had no interest in following the law. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger issue. Daniels's behavior was not just personal. It was systemic. The chief led her into the captain's office, where a large desk dominated the room, papers and files strewn across it. The captain, a heavy-set man with graying hair, looked up as they entered. His expression was unreadable, but Tara didn't expect anything less. She had been through enough internal investigations to know that the higher-ups often played the game of diplomacy, pretending to care about justice, but actually focused on preserving the status quo. The chief's voice broke the silence. "Captain, we need to talk about Daniels." The captain didn't look up at first, his eyes scanning the papers in front of him as if the conversation were a mere formality. Then, after a long pause, he finally lifted his gaze to Tara. "I've heard about the incident. Daniels's behavior is unacceptable, and I'll make sure it's addressed. But I need you to understand that we're dealing with a lot here. Things are never as simple as they seem." Tara's blood ran cold as she listened to the captain. He wasn't denying the injustice she had faced, but his tone, casual, almost dismissive, made it clear that he wasn't fully committed to taking action. It was all too familiar, the empty promises and hollow reassurances. Tara's instincts screamed that this was a case of one officer protecting another, of looking out for one of their own, even when he had clearly violated every professional standard. "I don't need reassurances," Tara said, her voice sharp as she stared directly at the captain. "I need action. Daniels shouldn't be a police officer if he's willing to abuse his power like this. I don't care what kind of pressure he's put on you. This is about doing what's right." The captain's eyebrows rose at her bluntness, but he quickly masked his surprise. "Agent Johnson, I understand your frustration, but you've got to understand the dynamics at play here. Daniels is a senior officer, and he has supporters in this department. Taking him down is not going to be a simple process. There will be repercussions for everyone involved." Tara's jaw tightened. She had heard this rhetoric before. The idea that going after the bad apples would cause a ripple effect that no one wanted to deal with. But Tara was no stranger to difficult decisions. She had spent years facing down the toughest situations, from taking down dangerous criminals to standing up against systemic issues. She wasn't about to back down now, not when someone had tried to destroy everything she had worked for. "Repercussions for everyone," Tara repeated, her voice low but full of conviction. "What about the repercussions of allowing someone like Daniels to continue with his badge and his authority? What message does that send?" The captain didn't respond immediately, instead folding his arms across his chest as if contemplating her words. His eyes briefly flickered to the chief, who stood silently behind her, clearly waiting for the captain to take the lead. It was clear that the captain was torn. He didn't want to upset the balance, but Tara could feel that his hesitation wasn't due to lack of awareness. It was rooted in the realities of the power structures within the police department. "Look," the captain finally said, his tone softening a bit. "I get it. I do. But you have to understand the complexity of the situation. Daniels has been a fixture in this department for years. He's got connections, and those connections can make things difficult." "Connections?" Tara's voice was laced with disbelief. "You're telling me you're willing to overlook what happened just because of a few connections?" The captain looked away, clearly uncomfortable under her gaze. Tara could tell he wasn't used to being challenged like this, but she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. "I'm not willing to overlook it," the captain muttered, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. "But I can't promise you that this will be easy. I'll launch an internal investigation, but you have to be prepared for the backlash. There are people who will try to protect Daniels, and I won't be able to shield you from that." Tara's resolve only hardened. "I'm not looking for your protection, Captain. I'm looking for justice, and if you can't give me that, then I'll find it myself." There was a long pause, and the captain seemed to weigh her words carefully. He finally nodded, his expression turning serious. "I'll start the investigation, but you'll need to cooperate with us. There will be questions, and I can't guarantee how it will play out. But I'll promise you this. I'll make sure Daniels answers for his actions." Tara nodded once, her mind already shifting into the next phase of her plan. She knew this wouldn't be easy, and the captain's half-hearted reassurances didn't inspire much confidence. But it was a start. She couldn't afford to give up, not when so much was at stake. As she turned to leave the office, she felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced down danger before, and she would do it again. This fight wasn't just for her. It was for every officer who had ever been silenced by the system, for every person who had been unjustly treated because of their race or gender. She wasn't going to let Daniels, or anyone else, continue to get away with this. Not on her watch. The escape plan. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly as Tara sat alone in the small, dimly lit holding cell. Her wrists were still sore from the tight handcuffs, and her mind raced with the injustice of what had just transpired. How could this be happening? The humiliation, the blatant racism, the abuse of power, it all seemed too surreal to process. But as she sat there, breathing deeply to steady her thoughts, she knew she couldn't let this situation break her. She had been through too much in her career, too many dangerous situations, to let this rogue officer, Daniels, get the best of her. The walls of the cell felt like they were closing in on her, but Tara forced herself to focus. She needed a plan. She couldn't just sit idly by while Daniels made a mockery of her authority. There had to be a way out. But how? The officers in the station, the ones who had seen her being dragged through the halls by Daniels, had barely reacted. It was as if this kind of behavior was expected, normal even. Tara's stomach twisted at the thought. It was clear she was on her own in this battle. Time crawled by, each passing minute amplifying her frustration and her growing desire to do something, anything, to regain control of the situation. Her mind sifted through the possibilities, but nothing felt right. She had to stay calm. Her badge was still in her jacket pocket, but with her hands cuffed, there was no way to retrieve it. She couldn't even get a phone call. Even if she could somehow get the cuffs off, there was no guarantee she would be able to find help. The station was eerily quiet, and the longer she stayed there, the less hope she had that anyone would intervene. Just as her frustration reached a boiling point, the door to the holding cell swung open. Tara's heart jumped as she saw a new face. A young officer in his early 30s with a nervous expression. He wasn't someone she recognized, and there was something different about him. He didn't have the same aura of authority that Daniels did. He seemed unsure of himself, almost hesitant. The officer stepped into the cell, glancing at her with a mixture of sympathy and wariness. "Agent Johnson," he began, his voice hesitant. "I'm Officer Mitchell. I was told to process you for holding, but I just want to say I'm sorry about all this." Tara studied him closely. His voice lacked the sharpness of Daniels, and his body language seemed less aggressive. It was a stark contrast to the cold, dismissive officer who had humiliated her earlier. For a brief moment, Tara allowed herself to consider the possibility that not everyone at the station was complicit in Daniels' actions. Maybe, just maybe, Officer Mitchell could be an ally. She remained silent for a moment, considering her next words carefully. "You know this isn't right?" she asked, her tone steady but firm. "What's happening here is a violation of my rights." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking to the door as if expecting someone to walk in at any second. "I don't make the rules," he muttered under his breath. "But I know something's off." Tara leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "You may not make the rules, Officer Mitchell, but you can choose whether or not to follow them. And right now, what Daniels is doing is illegal." The officer looked down at his notepad, clearly torn. His eyes darted around the small room, as if he were weighing his options. Tara could see the conflict in his face. She knew that sometimes people in his position wavered when push came to shove, especially when confronted with something they knew wasn't right. But was he really willing to take a stand against a senior officer? "I can help you, but you have to help me first," Tara said softly. "I'm an FBI agent. You know that. You also know that what Daniels did wasn't just a mistake. It's a betrayal of everything this station is supposed to represent." Mitchell hesitated, his pen trembling slightly in his hand. He opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by a sharp noise from the hallway outside the interrogation room. The door to the cell swung open, and the man Tara had hoped to avoid, Officer Daniels, stepped inside. His eyes locked onto Tara with contempt, and a cold smirk spread across his face. "What's taking so long, Mitchell?" he snapped, glaring at the younger officer. "She's just a perp. Get her processed, and let's move on." Mitchell straightened up, clearly uncomfortable under Daniels' glare. He nodded quickly, his voice strained as he muttered, "Yes, sir." His gaze flickered back to Tara for just a second, but it was enough for her to see the doubt in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, he was reconsidering his position. Daniels, seeing the hesitation, stepped forward, and pointed sharply at Tara. "Move her into holding, Mitchell. I don't want to see her face again." Tara stood up slowly, her heart pounding. The time for subtlety was over. She couldn't let Mitchell's hesitation go unnoticed. She had to make sure that whatever chance she had wasn't wasted. As Mitchell reached for her arm, she fixed her eyes on Daniels. "You're making a mistake, Officer Daniels," she said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "This is going to come back to you. You won't get away with this." Daniels laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that sent a chill down her spine. "Oh, I'm sure you think so, sweetheart," he sneered, mocking her. "But in this town, nobody cares about your so-called authority. You think because you have that shiny FBI badge you're untouchable. Think again." Tara stood tall, refusing to let his words break her. "I'm not here to impress you, Daniels," she said coldly. "I'm here to do my job. And trust me, there are people who will care. And when they find out what you did, you'll regret it." For a moment, something flickered in Daniel's eyes. A brief flash of uncertainty, maybe even fear, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He waved his hand dismissively. "Get her out of my sight." Mitchell, clearly rattled, took a step forward and motioned for Tara to follow him. She didn't hesitate. Every second now mattered. She needed to stay focused. As she walked behind Mitchell, the tension in the air felt palpable. She wasn't out of the woods yet, and every step she took brought her closer to whatever was waiting for her next. As they walked down the narrow hallway toward the holding cells, Tara's mind was still spinning. She couldn't let her guard down. She was close, but the real challenge was just beginning. Would Officer Mitchell come through, or would she find herself back in a cell before she could even make her next move? Mitchell unlocked the door to a small holding cell, and Tara stepped inside, her pulse racing. She wasn't sure what to expect next, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let this injustice slide. It was time to take action. The unexpected ally. Tara stood in the holding cell, her back against the cold metal wall, as she stared out at the empty hallway. The door had just closed behind her, and she had no idea what was going to happen next. Despite the crushing weight of the situation, her mind refused to slow down. She had been through many life-threatening circumstances before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a matter of her own safety. This was about something deeper, a message that needed to be sent. Her mind flashed back to the moment when she had been dragged from her car. The harsh treatment, the humiliation of being treated like a common criminal when she had done nothing wrong, had only fueled her anger. And now she was in a small holding cell, surrounded by people who seemed indifferent to her plight. She had always prided herself on being unflappable in the face of danger, but the isolation in this sterile, cold room began to wear on her. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Tara wasn't sure. Time had lost its meaning here. She sat on the hard bench, the tightness of the handcuffs cutting into her wrists, and struggled to keep her thoughts organized. She had to find a way out. But how? Daniels had already made it clear that he would stop at nothing to break her. He had been so sure of himself, so confident that his abuse of power would go unnoticed. But Tara knew better than to believe that. She would make sure he paid for this. The air in the station felt thick, oppressive even. Her pulse was racing as she stared at the door, waiting for the next step in whatever twisted game Daniels was playing. Then suddenly, the door swung open. Tara's head snapped up, her body tensing instinctively. She was ready for anything, except what she saw. It was Officer Mitchell again, the young officer who had shown a flicker of hesitation when Daniels had ordered her process earlier. His face was pale, his brow furrowed in worry, and his eyes darted nervously around the hallway before landing on her. He stepped inside the cell, his steps cautious, as if afraid of being caught. For a moment, neither spoke. Tara took in his uneasy expression, noting the way his hand trembled slightly as he gripped the doorframe. The weight of the situation seemed to press down on both of them, but Tara's instincts were on high alert. She couldn't afford to trust him blindly, not after everything that had happened. Mitchell closed the door softly behind him and leaned against the wall. "Agent Johnson," he started, his voice low and hesitant. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this up. This isn't right. What Daniels is doing, it's all wrong." Tara studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. This wasn't the same officer who had pushed her into the holding cell earlier. There was something different in his demeanor now. He seemed genuinely conflicted, and for the first time in hours, Tara felt a spark of hope. "You've seen what he's capable of," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with quiet strength. "You know what he's doing is abuse of power. You can't let him get away with this." Mitchell swallowed hard, looking down at his shoes for a moment. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes. "I know, but I can't just defy him. He's my senior. Daniels has a lot of influence in this department. If I speak out, I'm done for. And honestly, I'm scared. But—" Tara leaned forward, her gaze intense. "But you're scared of what's right, or you're scared of the consequences?" she asked, her voice sharp but calm. Mitchell faltered, his breath shaky. "I don't know," he muttered, "but what I do know is that I can't just sit back and do nothing. Daniels is crossing the line, and I don't know how much longer I can ignore it." Tara felt her pulse quicken. She had to act fast. "You still have a choice, Officer Mitchell," she said firmly. "You can make this right, but you need to decide what side you're on. You can help me now, or you can let this corruption continue." Mitchell's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but there was a hint of resolve starting to take root in his expression. He looked at her, the weight of his decision clear in his eyes. "I know," he whispered. "I know. And I've been thinking about it. I didn't sign up for this. I didn't sign up for Daniel's behavior, but I don't know what I can do." Tara didn't hesitate. She stood up from the bench, her back straight and her posture commanding. "You can start by getting me out of here." Mitchell's eyes widened. "What? You want me to just—" "Yes." She cut him off. "You have the keys, don't you? You have the ability to get me out of here. This is your chance to do something right. Not just for me, but for yourself. You'll be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life if you let Daniels continue this, and you'll never forgive yourself." Mitchell hesitated for a long moment, his eyes flicking nervously to the door. Tara's heart pounded in her chest. Every second felt like a countdown, the tension in the room palpable. She could see his internal struggle playing out, but she also saw something else, a glimpse of resolve in his eyes. Finally, Mitchell nodded, though his face was etched with doubt. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay. But we don't have much time. Daniels will figure out something's wrong soon enough." He quickly moved toward the door and unlocked it, then turned to face Tara. "You need to be quiet. Follow me." Tara's heart skipped a beat. This was it. There was no turning back now. She moved quickly, her mind alert, as she followed Mitchell through the darkened hallways. The station felt different now, every sound amplified, every step a risk. Mitchell moved cautiously, glancing over his shoulder every few steps, as if he expected someone to jump out from the shadows. They moved through corridors Tara didn't recognize, past desks where officers typed away, lost in their own work. No one seemed to pay attention to them, and that uneasy feeling in Tara's stomach grew stronger with each step. Was this really happening? Was Mitchell leading her to freedom, or was it just another trap? As they neared the back exit, Mitchell paused, looking at her with a mix of fear and determination. "I'm going to unlock the door, and then you need to get out as quickly as you can," he whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. "I can't go with you. If Daniels finds out, I'm done." Tara felt the weight of his words. She wasn't sure she could trust him completely. But at this point, she didn't have a choice. She needed to move, and she needed to move now. Mitchell pulled out a set of keys and, with trembling hands, unlocked the door. He opened it slowly, and a rush of cool air hit Tara's face, the sound of the night outside reaching her ears. She could hear the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. "This is it," Mitchell said, his voice strained. "You have to go now." Tara hesitated, glancing back at him one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude and determination. She didn't know if she would ever see Mitchell again, but right now she had to focus on the task at hand. As she stepped out into the cool night, the door clicked shut behind her. The street was empty, and the world outside felt both vast and intimidating. But for the first time in hours, Tara felt a glimmer of hope. She had a chance, one last chance, to expose Daniels and take him down for good. Her mind raced as she moved quickly down the alley, keeping to the shadows. She couldn't waste any time. She had to get back in touch with her team, to let them know what had happened, to make sure Daniels didn't get away with this. But as she moved through the dark streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. Daniels wouldn't stop. He couldn't. And now, Tara was determined to make sure he would pay for what he had done.